Hi everybody, it's Whitney from All the Shelves. Today I wanted to start a 5-part series where I talk about some of my favorite books from the time period I study. At my school, for our qualifying exams for a PhD, we have to choose a time period that we focus on. We have 4 lists that we make up, and each list has 30 books each, and we have to be prepared to do a written and a oral exam on those texts. And so one of our lists is a time period, for me that was of American literature, where we choose 30 books that were kind of representative of canonical literature and that we could possibly teach in the classroom later on. So for my time period, I chose 1900 to 1950. And for this series, I want to divide that time period into 10-year chunks and talk about some of the best stuff that I read. So without further ado, let's get started. The first book that I want to talk about is White Fang by Jack London. This is my favorite Jack London novel that I've read. I've read a number of his short stories and his novels, and in one video I talked about The Sea Wolf, which is really excellent. Like, you should read The Sea Wolf. But I think that if you're going to read one Jack London novel, White Fang should be that novel. It's the story of a wolf dog, and you begin with his mother as his mother struggles to survive in the wilderness, and meets a dog, and they get it on and they make White Fang. And through like a series of events, White Fang comes into contact with humans and is again and again abused by humans, by other dogs, and by social structures. So the book works as just a straightforward tale about a dog. It's devastatingly sad. If you are really adverse to reading about animal cruelty, then this would not be the book for you. But it also works really well on a metaphorical level. There's a lot to be said here about evolution, a theory that was just gaining a lot of traction at the time period, and especially Herbert Spencer's form of evolution, which was that survival of the fittest type concept, an evolutionary concept applied to social structures. So I read this book as, I think, a 10-year-old, and I really loved it. And then I read it in my 20s for my exams, and I thought it was even better. I think that this book works on so many levels for so many different audiences, so I would definitely recommend you check out White Fang if you haven't already. The next book I want to talk about is 3 Lives by Gertrude Stein. This is a very early example of modernism. It was published in 1909, and it's an example of Gertrude Stein really starting to explore that kind of modernistic style that she's known for, and actually that all the modernists are known for. Hemingway is more famous, and we read Hemingway's books in the classroom way more often, but it's pretty clear from this and other works that Gertrude Stein highly influenced Hemingway, not only in their writing style, but also in the subjects that they talk about. Anyway, I'm not going to say that this book is an easy read or even an enjoyable read. It's divided into 3 sections, and the 3 sections don't have much to do with each other at all, except for talking about similar themes about women and identity and sexuality and their working lives. And the first and the third parts are pretty accessible, but the second part is very dull and very repetitive. And so why am I recommending this thing? Not only because of its historical significance, but because if you can make it through that kind of repetition, if you can actually distance yourself from the reading experience and think about it analytically, it is very, very interesting. This is more of a intellectual pursuit than an entertainment pursuit. So if you're interested in modernism, Gertrude Stein, early American literature, this would be one that I recommended. If you were just looking for a fun read that would catch you up in a kind of plot, then this is not the book I recommend. But she does a lot with repetition. She thinks about how adjectives can delineate people and how those same adjectives can sometimes be quite meaningless when you can place them in different contexts, but we still use them to categorize people. And most interestingly, she thinks about that in terms of race in the second story. So yeah, Gertrude Stein's 3 Lives, check it out if you are brave enough or masochistic enough. I don't know, has anybody read this one? Maybe it's just me that was bored and I am not being fair to this one, but it was interesting. I wasn't bored, that's not the right word, but I wasn't entertained. The next book is Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. This book is really famous because it inspired the Food and Drug Act. It was written in 1906, and people were so horrified by the depictions of the meat industry in this that so much legislation was enacted, and the Food and Drug Administration what actually became an administration, became a thing to check up and make sure that there aren't rats in the meat or human blood or that meat is being stored at the correct temperature. Really though, they missed the point with this book. Yes, that's the most sensational part of the book, but the book is like very obviously a socialist manifesto. It's about these immigrants who come to Chicago and are just trying to survive horrific circumstances. So many greedy capitalists and politicians are using them as pawns in their games, and they are just like struggling to survive in whatever way possible. So it's sensational in the meatpacking stuff, and that stuff, like, don't get me wrong, is really gross out fun to read, but the pathos of the novel comes from the humans and their interactions with each other, not necessarily their interactions with the meat. I think that if you are interested at all in the political situation at the turn of the century, and you're interested in what seems appealing about socialism at that time period, especially in relation to labor rights and unions and that kind of stuff, then The Jungle is a must-read. And it is also not like Three Lives. It's interesting to read, and the plot is tedious, but in a way that you don't necessarily want to put down all the time. And the last book that I want to recommend from this time period is my favorite, which is Theodore Dreiser's Sister Carrie. This one might be one that you're familiar with. I know that it is required reading in a lot of high school classrooms and some American Lit type college classrooms. It's a story of a girl named Carrie who travels to Chicago. Again, it's Chicago, the hub of capitalistic greed and consumerism. She comes from a small town and she travels by train to this big city with all of these hopes that she is going to prove herself and make something of herself. And that proves to be a lot harder than she once suspected, and it's hard to get a job, and once she gets a job, it seems like her needs are just eating into all of her wages. She can't buy the pretty dresses that she wants or the pretty shoes. She can't live where she wants to live, and so she starts relying on men because men have a lot more opportunities than women do in this world. What I love about this novel is its ambiguity. I think Theodore Dreiser was trying to condemn conspicuous consumption and this idea that the more you have, the happier you're going to be. I do think that he doesn't like that kind of capitalistic greed. On the other hand, that's sort of the joy of reading it. You're excited for her to start making more money. You're excited when she finds a rich beau to like help her out, and how she manipulates that guy. You are excited and you recognize that there's some kind of powerful choice in consumerism, and it's like a way that she expresses her identity. So I like it for probably the opposite meaning that Dreiser originally intended, and I really like books that can support those oppositional readings. I think that it's that kind of ambiguity that keeps us reading these novels and debating them and thinking about them. So yes, Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser, I found it very readable. It was kind of a page turner for me. I don't know if that has been your experience with it. The one thing that I will say though is that I have this Penguin edition which has like a lot of pages added, and I have also read the one without all the additions, and I actually prefer the truncated version. Sometimes I feel like publishers are out to get like all of the pages that the author possibly produced and intended for the novel originally, but I think we need to recognize that editing is also an important process, and that the edited version of this is actually very good and succinct and not as obvious. So some of the themes that were once subtle in the first version are now very obvious in this extended version, and that kind of bugs me a little bit. So I wouldn't necessarily get the Penguin edition if you're gonna pick it up. Alright, I'm curious, do you also like novels from this time period? The 1900 to 1910 was a little bit more difficult for me because it had Henry James in it, and I am not a Henry James supporter. I'm not team Henry James by any means, so I had to read Wings of the Dove and wanted to scratch my eyes out. But what else have you read from the time period? And what else have you liked? And have you read these books? I suspect that some of you have, because these are very famous and also were probably forced upon you in some capacity, especially if you're an American. So yeah, leave me a comment down below and we will continue this discussion, and I will see you in my next video.